there's so much change happening with AI. We are seeing people feel high levels of stress at work than they've ever felt before. Interpersonal relationships plays a large role in that.
You describe 8 different archetypes of difficult people that we might encounter at work. Maybe you encounter one.
Well,
what should I do then?
Most of the advice out there was very generic, but there's 3 things that I would recommend.
クロスディグ101始まります。今日のテーマは苦手な同僚から心を守る方法です。Okay, so today we're joined by Amy Gallo, an editor at Harvard Business Review and the former host of the podcast Women at Work. And thank you so much for your time today, Amy.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the first thing I want to ask is, you describe 8 different archetypes of difficult people that we might encounter at work. So how did you come up with these archetypes?
Yeah. My first book was called The Harvard Business Review Guide to Dealing with Conflict. And in that book, I laid out a straightforward approach to dealing with conflicts. But what I found was when I would do talks or workshops about that book, people would come up to me and say, that was really helpful, but I have this one colleague. And then they would describe someone who really pushed their buttons, who really challenged them. And I started keeping notes about what those types of behaviors those people were exhibiting. And then through my work of doing these talks and workshops, as well as writing more articles and doing more research, I realized that most of the advice out there for dealing with difficult people was very generic. And in fact, there was lots of research that showed that what we need to do is be more specific, more targeted in our reactions to the behaviors. So how you deal with someone who is pessimistic and overly negative will be very different than how you deal with someone who all they care about is office politics and getting ahead. So the 8 archetypes came out of my listening to the people who are asking me questions about difficult people, as well as asking people in different surveys and online, asking what are the most challenging behaviors you have to deal with in your colleagues.
May I ask how many people you have asked, during the whole interview?
Yeah, it's in the various different forums, like in the talks and the workshops, and then online in the surveys, it's over about 5,000. But I'm curious, since you're from a different culture that I'm from, did the 8 archetypes sound familiar to you?
Yeah, I think I definitely resonate with probably half of it. I'm only working right now in this environment for about 3 to 4 years, but I think maybe if I'm working long enough, maybe I'm going to encounter all of them. And maybe in some other people's mind, I'm one of them as well, right? A difficult person for other people to deal with.
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that is one of the things I realized in writing the book myself, is that as I was researching and describing each of these archetypes, every chapter I was working, I had this moment where I thought, oh no, I've done this before. And I think a lot of people who read the book tell me, I realized not only how to help how to work with someone who I find difficult, but I also realized I could also help people work with me because they might be seeing me as the difficult person. So that's an important piece of self-awareness. And it's a way that people use the book that makes me very happy, because at some point, all of us in our careers have been the difficult person at work.
So please let me to move to the first section. Why work relationships are worth the trouble. And I think the first thing you mentioned in the book is the mindset of it's just work, never really actually work. So may I ask why it is the reason?
Yeah, I hear this a lot, right? It's just work. I shouldn't let it affect me. I shouldn't let it bother me. This isn't my real life. And I understand that impulse. I definitely have done a lot of that myself, especially earlier in my career. But the problem is your brain doesn't change. It doesn't know that it's just work. When you're at home, when you're with friends, when you're in your community, or whether you're at work, you have the same brain and you have the same thoughts. And so research backs this up. We aren't going to be a completely different person at work. And also, we are very invested. We spend 8 hours a day minimum, sometimes much more, with colleagues doing our job. And so whether they're going to have a real impact on us, whether we give them permission to or not. So the real question isn't, should I care? You already do. The question is, what are you going to do about it?
You mentioned an idea called amygdala hijack in your book. Would you mind to explain to us what that means?
Yeah, I think it's a really important concept to understand when you're dealing with difficult people, because part of the reason I wrote the book is that people feel so much emotion, mostly negative emotion, stress, frustration, anger, disappointment, all of these negative emotions. And oftentimes they're like, I don't understand. This is just one person, or is just one meeting, or, why am I so upset about an email? And the amygdala hijack term really explains that, because the amygdala is the part of your brain that detects threats. And when it's fired, when it's activated, it can override our rational thinking before you've even had a chance to decide how you want to respond. So your brain can't tell the difference between a physical threat and a social one. So a colleague dismissing your idea in a meeting can trigger the same response to genuine physical danger. So in that very moment, when you most need to think clearly and respond thoughtfully to that other person, your brain is often working against you.
Yeah, I think a bit of like a different idea, but it's very hard to not take like things personally, right?
Exactly. And the brain wants to make sense of it. Our brains are sense-making machines. So when something negative happens, it wants to make sense of it. And it often tells us a story that, makes it feel personal. It makes it feel as if this is only happening to me. And those negative stories start to feel very real. But really, when you need to get out of that amygdala hijack, do some mindfulness, take a break. Once you look at it a little more clearly, you can start asking yourself questions of like, okay, what do I know for real here? What is actually true?
So there is some data here. This is a survey from back in 2024. So I think in Japan, around 70% of workers report experiencing strong stress related to their current jobs. Among the causes, interpersonal relationships account for 26.1%. Do you think this is something unique to Japan, or do you see the same thing happening in the US as well?
Certainly the same thing happens in the US. I think we are seeing people feel more high levels of stress and burnout at work than they've ever felt before. And a lot of that is, there's so much change happening with AI, with organizations restructuring, with layoffs. We're experiencing the input of more information than we ever have in our lives. So we're already overloaded. And then we go into work where we have these interpersonal interactions where oftentimes there's miscommunication or misunderstanding, and that plays a big role. So I'm definitely seeing the same thing in the US and in the other countries where I do work, is people are reporting very high levels of stress, and the interpersonal relationships plays a large role in that.
Let's move on to the next section. So finding out who you are actually dealing with. So I think before we look at others, you mentioned the importance of cleaning up your side of the street first before you pointing fingers at others. So can you tell us what that means?
It means acknowledging that your own role in a difficult dynamic before focusing on the person. So it's easy to fixate on what's wrong with them, all of their negative behavior, what they're doing wrong. But there's one consistent element in every conflict you've ever had, and that's you. So before pointing fingers, you really need to ask yourself, what am I bringing to this? What stress am I bringing? Like we talked about, am I burned out? So you can't control how they act. So you need to clean up your side of the street in terms of controlling how you interpret and respond. That's where you get the real success, the real leverage.
Okay, thank you. So please let me introduce to our audience the 8 different types you mentioned in your book. So the first one is the insecure boss, the pessimist, the victim, the passive-aggressive peer, the not-at-all, the tormentor, the biased coworker, and the political operator. So among all of this, maybe you encounter one in your own personal life and like someone you still think about right now.
Well, I actually worked for a tormentor, which was not fun at all, right? The tormentor, I use that word because it's someone who we think should be a mentor because they're senior to us. Maybe they're your boss, maybe not, but then they actually end up tormenting you instead of mentoring you. And I had a boss earlier in my career that really would change her opinion about something or her direction overnight. So at 6 p.m., she would say, we need to get this done by tomorrow morning. And then I would get it done. And the next morning she would say, why did you do this? Why did you spend your time on this? This isn't important. And I could tell that it wasn't that she forgot. She told me. She actually, I think, was questioning whether I would respond to her. She made me doubt whether I was right for the job. And it felt very intentional. I'm not sure it was intentional. I can never know what her motivation was, but it felt very much like she was trying to make my job very hard.
So this is the type of tormentor, as you say, right? What are the tactics we can try here to maybe when we're like encountering this type of people?
Yeah, I mean, their attitude is essentially with a tormentor, it's I suffered and so should you, right? They have very impossible standards. They accuse you of not being committed the way that my boss did. And when you push back, they act as if it's a character flaw, that you're not up for the job or you're not tough enough. And it's important to understand that this behavior often stems from a lack of empathy, right? Research shows that we actually underestimate how hard our past struggles were. So we assume others should be able to handle what we handle. So in terms of tactics, the most effective thing you can do is try to reduce the sense of competition, because whether they're conscious of it or not, they often see you as a threat. And I believe that my boss, who was the tormentor, did see me as a threat. And so you want to show genuine interest in what they've been through. You can ask them, what was it like for you to come up in this career? What were the obstacles they faced? What were the sacrifices they made? Understanding that and showing that you're interested in that can help disarm them in ways that pushback never will. And then you also want to look at a shared goal you can focus on together, something that puts you on the same side. You want to think about how can you help them, and then also what can you do that will help your own career in a way that helps them. So you want to try to find a sort of win-win situation with them. The real thing you want to do is also resist the urge to up the ante if they're being competitive. That tug of war between you two, you're very unlikely to win. They usually have more power than you. They usually have more experience. So you want to save your energy to put into the work, not into trying to compete with this person.
How about this one, the passive-aggressive peer? So who are these type of people and how can we deal with them?
This actually was the very first archetype I developed for the book. And it was sort of the reason for the book, to be honest, because it's incredibly common. So this is someone who seems totally on board. They seem committed. They seem, willing to take on the project or do the work until they aren't. So they agree to do something and then they don't do it. Or they miss deadlines and they don't explain why. They might make cutting remarks like a insult and then just say, oh, I was just joking. I have no idea what you're talking about. And you end up questioning your own version of reality. It can often happen in cultures where direct confrontation is not allowed. So people find other ways to express their thoughts or feelings. When they do that in a positive way, it's okay to not be direct. I'm not saying that every culture, every person in every workplace needs to be direct, but the problem is that they're doing it in a negative way that undermines the conversation instead of a positive way of sharing their thoughts and ideas. You can do that indirectly, but as long as it's with a positive intention rather than a negative one.
I guess this type is probably like something very, very common, maybe especially in Japan. Because as you say, confrontation is not actually a culture, like not that direct here, right?
Yes. Yeah. And it's a culture that prioritizes group harmony, which is wonderful. The problem is that sometimes what looks like harmony is actually not harmony. And that's the real challenge with passive aggressive people, is that it can feel, we call it shadow boxing, that you're sort of boxing with a shadow. You can't actually land a connection with someone. And you can't, you can say, are you sure you want to do it? And they'll say, well, no, you asked me to, so I guess I have to, right? And so oftentimes the attempts to get them to be more straightforward don't always work. But there's three things that I would recommend. Well, very first, don't call them passive aggressive. It can be tempting, at least in cultures where we tend to be more direct. We can say, you're being passive aggressive, but that doesn't help, right? That only will put them on the defensive and likely encourage them to be more passive aggressive rather than less. And it just makes things worse. One of the second tactic I'll mention is that you want to focus on the content of what they're trying to say. So if they say, I don't think I'm the right person, but I guess I'll do it, you want to, instead of saying, okay, I guess you're going to do it, is to see what is their underlying concern. You might even ask a question. Oh, wait, before you agree to do it, let me understand a little bit more. Who do you think would be the right person to do this? Or what is your hesitation? It's not always successful because they're being passive aggressive. They may not be honest with you or open with you, but at least you've tried to address the underlying concern. And that attempt will often be felt by them. The third thing is you really want to make it as safe as possible for the person to be direct with you. And that means if they make a passive aggressive comment, you can say, if you truly believe you're not the right person to do this, please let me know. I'd like to discuss it.
I remember about this person. I think I probably did try, maybe not that well, but I did try to, talk a bit more with them. But I think the person was just like, they don't really want to talk to me. They don't really want to have a conversation. And they were having like what's the word I'm looking for? Like, even talking to you is wasting my time. And that just makes it very, very hard I don't know what else I can do anymore. So what should I do if this kind of things happen again in the future?
Well, one, I would reflect on what happened in that interaction. Every time we interact with someone we find difficult, it's an opportunity to learn, even if the situation doesn't change, even if we consider it a quote unquote failure. So reflect on what you did, what you didn't do, what you wish you had done differently. When you just told me, maybe I didn't do it successfully. I tried that, but maybe I didn't do it right. Think about what would have maybe made a difference. Now, to be clear, sometimes there's nothing you can do to get someone to behave less passive aggressively or to be the tormentor toward you. There's sometimes you can't control whether they behave differently, but you want to reflect on what happened. The other thing I find can be really helpful is to find someone who works well with that person. So if your colleague was passive aggressive to you and you weren't working well, is there someone else in the organization who does work well with them? And can you go and talk to that person and say, I really want to have a positive relationship with Helen. Do you have any advice for me on how to best work with her?
So I think while some Japanese companies have a relatively flat culture, many traditional workplaces still maintain a fairly strict hierarchy. So as a result, speaking up to your boss can be very challenging and risky. If the difficult person is someone with a lot of power over you, such as an insecure manager, what would be the safest first step to take?
This is an important question because every time we choose whether to push back or use a certain tactic, we always have to make the mental calculation of what are the risks and what are the benefits of speaking up. And it could be that you're in an environment with a boss or with an organizational culture that's very hierarchical, that it's not safe to speak up. You can't push back. If that's the case, then the question is to try to talk to other people there of how have they addressed difficult situations that have come up in the past. Has anyone had success, whether it's going to HR, whether it's talking directly to the boss? What have other people had success with, and what can you learn from that? If you stay silent, if you don't address this, what will happen? Will the project be a failure? Will you be burnt out in this job? Will your boss continue to mistreat you? So don't just focus on the risks of speaking up. Those might be real, but also think about the risks of staying silent.
There are actually a lot more examples and insight in the book. So if you're interested, please read the book here. It's also available in Japanese. So let's move on to the final part. Don't give up yet, protecting your own well-being. So what are your core universal principles for getting along with anyone at work?
Well, in the book, I talk about 9 different principles, and I won't go into every single one here, but just to give you an example, you need to focus on what you can control. And you often think, oh, if I could just get them to stop being passive aggressive, if I could just get them to stop undermining me. But you can't make that happen. What you can control is your response, your behavior, what your communication, what you say to them and what you don't. The other one that I'd like to mention is that you don't want to make it you versus them. It's often easy when you're dealing with a difficult colleague for it to start to feel like a tug of war. Either I'm good and they're bad, or I'm right and they're wrong. Instead of trying to envision you and the other person in a sort of combat or in a struggle, what I try to envision is myself and the other person on the same side of the table. And there's a third entity in the dynamic, which is the problem we need to solve. If you see yourselves as collaborators trying to solve the same problem, you're going to go in with a much better mental attitude, and you'll be much more likely to be able to sort of loosen the tension between you and hopefully collaborate better together.
There's one principle in all of your 9 principles I find very, very important. You talk about avoid gossip. Why is this important, you think, in the workplace?
Yeah, so the principle is actually avoid gossip mostly. and it's because gossip is very complicated. The research on gossip is fascinating because it's evolved as something that helps a group bond. When you and I share a moment where we discuss something about someone who's not present, you and I then feel a little bit more social connection. And it's part of what motivates us, right? We're sharing information. It's been very important for people who are outside the normal power structure to gather information about why the organization is doing what it's doing, why leadership may be making the decisions, what changes might be coming our way. So it's important to know that there are positive sides to gossip. However, when you're dealing with a difficult person, gossip unfortunately leads to something called confirmation bias most often. So let's say you and I work together with someone named Kai. And Kai, we both find to be passive aggressive. Well, if you and I start gossiping, saying, oh my gosh, can you believe how passive aggressive Kai is? Can you believe that he said that in that meeting? Right? It feels good because now you've confirmed my version of reality. We feel a little more bonded. It feels great. The problem is now, whenever we're in a meeting with Kai, anything he says, we now see through that lens of passive aggressive. And we are sort of winking at each other going, see, he's doing it again. He's doing it again. So anything he does becomes confirmation that he is passive aggressive. And one of the things we need to do with these archetypes is allow people to surprise us, allow them to change. And gossip doesn't do that.
How about a hybrid work environments? I think especially after COVID, a lot of companies will use Slacks or Messengers or Google Chat to talk to their colleagues. And what's your golden rule for handling disagreement when it's online and versus when it's in person?
Yeah, this is one of the things that I've been asked a lot about since the pandemic, because so many people are interacting more online via text or via Zoom with, we're all little squares on a screen. We're missing a lot of the nuance, a lot of the emotion that we pick up on when we hear someone's voice, or we can see their body language, or when we look them in the eye. There's actually interesting research that shows between 2005 and 2019, so this was even, the research ended before the pandemic, we were speaking 300 less words every day. So we know we're moving to more and more text-based communication. It's very difficult to resolve a conflict or to try to form a more positive relationship with a difficult colleague if we're not picking up on that emotion, if we're not picking up on that nuance, and we can't convey that nuance or emotion to them. The other thing, if you think about, there's something called the online disinhibition effect, which is that people are willing to say things in text that they wouldn't necessarily say to someone's face. So my rule of thumb is that text-based communication is fine. Most of the interactions we have that are neutral or even positive can happen there. But as soon as things get tense, I try to change the medium. So, hey, can I give you a call? Or can we hop on a Zoom? One thing to know is that Zoom or video chat in general can often feel quite aggressive, because if you and I are in the same room and we're talking, we're not looking at each other's eyes the whole time. We're looking around the room, we're looking at the table, Zoom is sort of artificial and it can feel very intense because you're looking someone in the eye. I generally try to call someone, because then we don't have the direct eye contact, which can feel too intense, but I can hear their tone of voice, and I can convey a lot more with my tone of voice. I can convey that I'm curious or that I want to be collaborative. The same goes if you work with someone. I often try to take a walk with them, because then you're not looking directly in the eye, but you're moving forward, which indicates we're going to make some progress, things can change, and that we are then able to talk and hear each other without necessarily just staring each other down.
Would you mind to give us some practical self-care habits that we can probably practice by ourselves?
Of course. At the end of the day, don't think about the positive or neutral interactions I've had. I think about that one interaction that was really bothersome to me. So to help protect your mental health, to help protect your sanity, you have to remember, have a life outside work. Make sure you have friends, make sure you're engaged in your community, do things that help distract you and also give you positive feelings, so that even if the work situation is difficult, you have part of your life where you can feel less stress, you can feel less burnout, and you can feel sort of rejuvenated by those other relationships. One of the other things I do is keep a compliment folder. So in my email, I have a folder that's for compliments, where if someone sends me a note and says, "Thank you so much for your book, it meant a lot to me," I put that in my compliment folder. Or if a colleague says, "Oh, it was so fun to work with you on that project, I hope we get to do it again," it goes in that folder. I have about just over 100 of emails in that folder now, and I use that anytime I'm feeling frustrated or burnt out. It helps me remind me why I do the work. It helps remind me that I am a good colleague, that what the work I do matters and it's important to people. One of the other things I really like to do is to remind myself that all of this, even if it's difficult, is a learning opportunity. And it allows me to develop my emotional intelligence skills, which are some of my most prized skills, especially in the age of AI. Those are things that and robots and machines can't replicate. So even if I have a really challenging interaction with someone, I want to be curious about, okay, what am I learning? What do I want to do differently next time? What do I wish was different? What awareness do I need, whether it's social awareness or self-awareness, to make this situation better? And the situation itself may not improve, but ideally you have improved as an employee, as a person, as a human, and you've developed that emotional intelligence to make you better at your job and just more happy and satisfied in life.
Can I just ask you one more? I think there's another tip you mentioned in your book, write things down.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it can be really helpful to write down. Well, there's two reasons to write things down. One is to document what's happening because, as I mentioned, when we are in that amygdala hijack, our brains often tell us stories about what's happening. And sometimes those stories make it feel like it's all our fault. So writing things down, documenting them helps you make sense of what's happening. But it's also very helpful if the situation becomes very intense. Perhaps HR gets involved or your boss gets involved. It's helpful to have a record of what's been going on and to document when that person exhibited the behavior that was a problem and what they did and what you did in response.
So write down what happened, the incident, and then maybe you also write down what you're feeling about it, and eventually maybe what you're going to do about it.
That's right. And I think you always want to think about what you're going to do about it, because one of the things that happens is we often focus on, oh, why did this happen to me? Why do I feel so powerless? Why can't this person be different? And we want to give ourselves agency. We want to give ourselves the power to change something, even if it's something very, very small. The more you give yourself that agency and that power, the more you create a plan about what you're going to do, the more you'll feel ready for whatever comes next. And it transforms negative emotion into action, which can be much more positive for our mental health. We know that when we feel agency, we feel much more satisfied and we feel much more engaged in the work that we do.
Thank you so much. So before I let you go, the final question is, what if someone tried all of the tactics you have in the book and then still nothing changed? What should they do then?
Yeah, this is a real question, is whether is the environment the problem, right? Or is this one interaction the problem? If you can't protect yourself from the negativity of that interaction, if you can't find solace or find reassurance in your other colleagues, if you find yourself just consumed by this relationship or this interaction, it may be time to look for another job, because sometimes the environment can't be fixed. The decision then becomes, how long can I stay here? And what I like to tell people is, rather than just saying, oh, I quit, I'm out of here, which isn't a possibility for everyone, is to start to lay a plan, which is to say, okay, I'm going to give it 3 months. I'm going to try these tactics. And then after 3 months, I'm going to see, did things change? And do I want to give myself a little more time, or is it time to move on? And I encourage people to be as specific as possible, right? Is it that I don't want to have a stomach ache when I open emails from my boss? Is it that I want to feel like at least 2 people in this organization value my work and my expertise? What is it that you want? What's the bar that you need? And how long are you willing to try to get it? And what are you going to try to do to encourage that to happen? You can then with that plan in place, you won't necessarily feel stuck, but you'll feel like you can perhaps take some action. I will encourage people, though, to be careful. Sometimes we always think it's going to be so much better over there. That job will be the perfect job. There'll be no one difficult there. You're always going to have difficult people wherever you work. I've never worked in a job where there wasn't someone who challenged me in that way. And so you have to be ready the next time it comes up. Am I ready? Have I done the work? Have I reflected enough? Have I developed the emotional intelligence I need to address this challenge in a much more positive way?
Okay, Amy, thank you so much for your time today. It's such an honor to talk to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for reading the book and for these great questions. This was really a fun conversation for me.
今日は以上になります。チャンネル登録と高評価、そしてクロスディッグの公式 X フォローもお願いいたします。